so much for agreeing to this. And I'll start with the first question then.
Sure.
As we understand it, there is no such thing as, for example, a hegemonic masculine man. How are plural models reflected in people's practices? How do they interact with these masculinities?
Well, let's try to tease that out a little conceptually. I think, there are many social situations where we can say there's a certain pattern of practice that can be understood as hegemonic, and certain people engage in those practices, inhabit or occupy that position we can call a hegemonic one in gender relations. So we can actually identify particular people who are, if you like, bearers of hegemonic masculinity or enactors of hegemonic masculinity. And therefore I don't see any difficulty in saying, those particular men there are enacting this, are in that structural position of privilege in gender relations and have power to cause things to happen in ways that other groups of men don't. But I think it's also very important to recognise, and this I guess was one of the breakthrough points in the emergence of contemporary research about masculinities, that is never the only pattern of masculinity on the scene at a given time. There are always other patterns of masculinity too. That was the mistake that was made by the sex role literature. There was a literature about the male sex role, which assumed more or less that there was just one pattern of masculinity and people conformed to it or failed in conforming to it. But it was important to see that there are a variety in more or less any social situation that you care to research. You will find more than one pattern of practice that's associated with the structural position of being a man. They may well often do include overlapping practices, but they also differ in the range of admissible practices, in the characteristic responses to problems and so forth. When we say there are plural models of masculinity, I think, that's one way of abstracting from a situation. More generally, you could say there are plural configurations or patterns of practice, and we can associate conceptual models with each of those. And I guess that's what I did in writing the theoretical section of my book, Masculinities. But it's the configurations on the ground that matter most. And that's what we need to research and, of course, understand in practice.
Could you please tell us about the costs and consequences of hegemonic masculinity on people, both men and women?
Yeah, well, that depends, of course, on what the particular pattern of hegemonic masculinity is. And I think it's quite important to know that the configuration that holds a hegemonic position in gender relations in one social context may be different from what holds the hegemonic position in another social context, so that hegemonic masculinity changes over time and can vary from one social milieu to another. So we may say that the pattern of masculinity that's hegemonic in corporate management, if we're researching businessmen's lives, which I have done a bit of, that pattern will be different from what is hegemonic in, say, a poor working class community. So let's be clear then that the patterns of hegemonic masculinity may differ, and therefore their downstream consequences both for the men who enact them and for other people in that situation may also differ. For instance, if we look at the pattern of masculinity that's hegemonic in corporate business, and I think this is, there are, with some variations, very similar patterns in different parts of the neoliberal global economy. When you look at the lives of businessmen in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, I think there are fairly similar patterns. These hegemonic patterns involve a gender division of labour, a domestic division of labour, where very few of these men take any significant role in childcare. That's assigned to wives, professional childcarers and so forth. In the workplace, the hegemonic pattern of masculinity in corporate business involves a massive contribution of time and energy to the workplace. So these men work long hours. It involves capacity for travel, a lot of international travel. It involves stark competitiveness and willingness to commit to corporate goals of profit maximisation and disregarding the toxic consequences for people outside the corporate management. Now, of course, that pattern of masculinity, which is hegemonic in international business, has very important consequences for the people affected by the operations of the corporation, who may never actually see the particular managers involved, but whose villages may be destroyed when the corporation builds a dam, who may suffer floods or toxic injury when there's industrial accident, who may be driven out of employment through wage decisions of hiring, investment decisions that shift industries from one country to another. There are all kinds of consequences of this pattern of masculinity in the position of power in corporate business. Now, the pattern of masculinity that's hegemonic in a certain working class milieu may have some overlap with that. For instance, may have a similar domestic division of labour where men are not expected to do childcare, for instance, but have a very different pattern of workplace relations, which may be associated with cooperation and solidarity in the workplace rather than competition and profit-making, which may involve different broad attitude to the world and so on. So I think it would be a mistake to say that there is one set of consequences of hegemonic masculinity. But we can say that a very general consequence of the overall pattern of hegemony in gender relations in the gender order of the society as a whole is the relative concentration of power, authority and resources in the hands of men, and the diminution of power, resources and authority on the part of women, so that the consequences for women are likely to include the various consequences of exclusion, powerlessness and higher levels of poverty. And those will be impacts on health. In Catholic countries, for instance, they may involve restrictions on contraception and abortion rights, so there are very definite bodily consequences. In many societies, it involves vulnerability to gender-based violence, or in many parts of society, it involves that. So all of those are consequences of patterns of hegemony, and that's, I guess, the general reason why we often, rightly, see existing hegemonic masculinities as a major problem in the lives of very large numbers of people, including the men themselves, of course, because there are health consequences of the restriction on emotional life, maybe, for some enactments of hegemonic masculinity in working class life, there is greater level of risk in the workplace. Industrial accidents, driving accidents and so forth are more prominent among working class men than other groups. It's a long answer, but I think it's worth taking the trouble to tease out those more complicated consequences so that we don't fall into stereotypes of hegemonic masculinity as bad, as toxic in a kind of stereotyped way.
The term practice has a wide range of meanings in the different disciplinary branches of the social sciences, and it would be useful to define precisely how that term is used. Since this conference is based on interdisciplinarity, would you please elaborate on the concept of masculinities as configurations of practice?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. The term practice is a pretty basic term in the human sciences, but it's also quite a broad one and has different implications, I guess. For me, talking about social practice is a way of emphasizing certain things about human activity. First of all, that it's social, that we're concerned with the way people interact, the way they do things together, the effects social structures have, that kind of thing. It's also a way of emphasizing what I think of as the historicity of human activity. So, I mean, we are a species of animal, but we're a species that very distinctively lives in societies. And those societies are historical. They come into existence at a certain time, and they change through time too. So when we talk about practices, we're emphasizing human social activity in time with consequences, with downstream consequences that affect the lives of other people and that produce change through time also. And to me, that's just as important as what philosophers actually often emphasize when they talk about praxis or practice, praxis being the Greek word that's the origin of that word in most European languages, where they emphasize that it's activity that contains an element of reason or purpose or knowledge or significance, so that it's not random activity, it's not reflex, like when your knee gets tapped or when the dog salivates when Dr. Pavlov rings the bell. And it's not necessarily driven by unconscious forces outside our control, but that it's meaningful and often we can, assign purposes to it, understand what's going on. So saying something is praxis to me, or practice to me, has those kinds of implications: being social, being historical, being meaningful activity. So when I say that when I talk about masculinities as configurations of practice, I'm meaning to say there's something there that's a lot more than simply just an identity or, the interpretation of a certain body or form of embodiment. That it's human activity with those characteristics of meaningfulness, historicity, and so forth, and therefore has social consequences down the line. I'm trying to get a concept to emphasize a concept of masculinity that is contained in social processes with consequences.
In which way could we think of non-hegemonic sexual and bodily practices as practices of resistance? And, more broadly, is the concept of resistance useful in thinking about non-hegemonic masculinities?
Very interesting question. Very tricky and relevant to the kind of everyday level of politics. So what I think what one could do in the everyday to contest and challenge patriarchal power, I really have some doubts about whether we can see non-hegemonic masculinities or patterns of practice as resistance simply because they are non-hegemonic. So, for instance, I have in some of my thinking about masculinity suggested we need a concept of complicit or compliant, perhaps would be a better word, masculinities, which are patterns of practice for men who don't actually occupy the hegemonic position in any strenuous way, but give more or less passive support to it because of the broad benefits to men that patriarchal superiority of men delivers. So you might have a non-hegemonic form of masculinity there, which is very definitely not resistant. And you can have what I originally called marginalised masculinities, thinking there especially of masculinities in marginalised ethnic groups, which may also be involved in the subordination of women, in the construction of hierarchies between men and women, but not in a way that commands consent across or assent across the whole gender order. So they're not exactly hegemonic in the sense of the whole gender order, but may offer, for instance, exemplary masculinities, such as the masculinities of sporting heroes, or combat troops, or something like that. One would hardly see them as resisting the gender power structure, though they are not the hegemonic form of masculinity either. So what I would be inclined to say, if we're wanting to think about resistance, the really crucial thing is there a collective practice of resistance there, not just an alternative to a hegemonic form, but a shared practice that actually begins to change structures of inequality. That is a rather more strenuous concept of resistance, but it perhaps allows us to identify forms of masculinity that were not included in my original fourfold model of patterns of masculinity, but which a number of people have documented since. And that is, actively subversive forms of masculinity, or if you like, oppositional masculinities, which are contesting the hegemonic pattern in the name of greater gender equality. And that is incredibly difficult to do as an individual. If you simply stop enacting recognisable forms of masculinity, if you are embodied as a man and socially recognised as a man, and you suddenly start individually behaving in a very different way, you'll probably just be regarded as eccentric or mad rather than as engaged in politics. But where many of you start doing the same thing is involved with forms of practice with a downstream. Coming back to my point right at the beginning about the historical character of practice, you're engaging in a shared way in practices that have a downstream effect of changing inequalities, then that I think is, legitimately seen as practices of resistance. And of course, that's what I very much hope to encourage. You may still be seen as mad, but you will have other people sharing your madness, and there will be point to the madness.
There have been debates about where to place fathering and more specifically men's caregiving practices in your theorization about masculinities. How do you perceive these attempts to connect some specific practices with your social organization of masculinity conceptualization? And how do you think about fathering and how would you place it in your theorization?
Look, it's an interesting and important issue. It's important because fathering is one of the areas where very large numbers of men are, in contemporary societies, both in the global north and the global south, very large numbers of men are in doubt and are actually seeking for new and hopefully better social practices. So that this is really a key issue in contemporary masculinity politics. It wasn't a major theme in my initial attempt to create a conceptual framework around masculinity. It was there, but in a rather subdued way, so that I did understand the hegemonic pattern of masculinity in societies like my own as involving fatherhood, but in a context where there was a fairly strong gender division of labour in the household, with active parenting being largely assigned to the mother and a kind of general supervisory role assigned to the father. In fact, when I was doing concrete research rather than theorising about masculinities, fathering did in fact come much more into focus. So that, for instance, when we were interviewing ruling class men, ruling class fathers, in the project on education, which actually was the background to a lot of my theorising, we found a really interesting pattern about fathering, where when their children, these are now rich and powerful bourgeois men, managers, property owners and the like. When the children were young, the parenting was largely handed over to the mother and to other carers. When the children got into adolescence, the fathers actually became more involved because, and partly because more money was being spent and they had business decisions to make, like what private school would they send the child to, the boy or girl to, what university would be in mind, what career the child, especially boy, would have in the future. Those kinds of things. So at that point, bourgeois men enacting a hegemonic form of masculinity in Australian society did become actively engaged as fathers, though in a very distinctive way. So that was one pattern. Then much later, when I was doing more research on managerial masculinities, this is the research, some of which is reported in my paper in the German journal Feministische Studien. we found a quite interesting pattern that seemed to have a generational dimension, where and we were now again dealing with quite powerful men, managers of companies, some of them quite senior figures in quite large Australian corporations. The older ones showed this very clear division of labour around domestic work and childcare, where they were earning the living, they were totally involved. This is the kind of business masculinity I was talking about before. They travelled a lot, they were away a lot, they worked very long hours. The children were the wife's business, the mother's business. But among younger managers, we did find anxiety about this problem and the presence of another ideal of fatherhood, which was much more hands-on, emotionally engaged, and concerned about the quality of relationship between the father and the child, which is very much what reform movements about good fathering have been arguing for in the last generation. So it was fascinating to see this emerging also in at least the younger generation of the bourgeois managerial class. But they faced it as a really stark life problem. They couldn't just, take, a couple of days off a week to be a hands-on father. That would actually destroy their managerial career. So they faced it as a stark choice. Be a good father in the way that they'd learnt now to understand it, or be a good provider and good manager in the way that the corporation required of them. They couldn't do both. Now, we were doing interviews at one point in time, so I never heard the consequences, but it would be interesting, really quite fascinating, to follow that kind of situation through and see how those young couples actually resolved the contradiction. Yeah. So, yes, the issue about fathering, I think, is important. It has emerged repeatedly in my own research. And I'm delighted when people try to grapple with that conceptually. Decisions about fathering or not fathering as a fundamental part of any pattern of masculinity, just as decisions about motherhood, mothering, reproduction are elements of any pattern of femininity, even if the crucial decision is not to be a mother or not to be a father. There is still, if you like, a socially coded position in relation to fatherhood and motherhood in any pattern of masculinity. That's the level at which I would now try to connect it to theorising about masculinity.
To the best of our knowledge, religious studies is not one of the central areas of study which feature in your critical analysis of masculinities. Is there any specific reason why? Religion has recently surfaced to the fore because of several issues, especially with regard to same-sex marriage. Generally speaking, Christians, Jews, Muslims and others are perceived as traditional people. We can then ask ourselves how they manage the relation between the institutional norm and its embodiment. Could you come back to this question about the tensions between the norm and its embodiment?
There's very interesting questions there. Firstly, there's not a specific reason, and I've been reflecting on why. I guess one reason is that Australia is now a strongly secular society. So religious debates are not, or were not, points of conflict when I designed my first research on masculinity. I think it's important to recognise that there is not a singular norm governing gender practices in almost any society or social context. This is something that Rebecca Pearce and I have discussed in our recent paper in the journal Feminist Economics, if anyone wants to look it up, where we point out that there are quite a variety of gender norms rather than a singular gender norms, and that the norms that can be found in gender relations include norms of equality and justice, as well as norms of inequality and exclusion. And I think this is also true. I mean, the case I know best is Protestant Christianity, of course, having grown up in that. And in a church like the Anglican or Episcopalian church, one is very conscious of the wide range of doctrine, of beliefs and associated practices. So in the church I was brought up in, there's now a major split between those who approve of the ordination of women as priests and those who oppose it. The mainstream in that church, I think, now is in favour of the ordination of priests, of women as priests, though there are some dioceses that still resist it, including, I'm ashamed to say, the Diocese of Sydney. But in Lutheran churches in Scandinavia, that's now mainstream practice. In the Catholic Church, of course, it's still totally resisted. Well, mostly resisted, officially resisted. So there's major divisions within religion around that, and I think that is also the case, though the balance is somewhat of positions is somewhat different around homosexuality and same-sex marriage. In Australia, for instance, where there's a majority of people in a majority of the population in surveys endorse same-sex marriage. The politicians will not agree to it because of the power of a right-wing fundamentalist Christian lobby. So there, it's not the majority view, but a minority view that actually has the political capacity to control the issue. What can one say? I mean, another complication is that people may officially assent to a normative position on gender issues, but in practice act otherwise. I mean, this is famously true about contraception, about the pill, which I think is still officially forbidden by the Catholic Church, but which a majority of Catholic women, certainly in my country, I think in many countries, nevertheless use in practice without very much trouble. It's in talking about norms, one always has to be wary of the potential gap between official norm and actual social practice. In this case, if you like, embodied practice. I guess what I would want to say at the end is, I mean, don't simply think of religious norms as repressive. They're also in religious traditions norms of emancipation, of equality, and of justice. And they are also important components of certainly Islam, of Christian traditions, I think of Buddhist traditions too. There are models of social justice and equality. as well as a great deal of misogyny and homophobia. So in wrestling with issues around religion, I pay attention to the plurality within religious traditions and norms.
When we talk about hegemony, we obviously think about Gramsci. We would like to come back to the way Gramsci opposed himself to the concept of false consciousness and how, in his view, subordinated people would rationally consent to hegemony. What would your position be concerning these concepts? Have these notions been important for your thoughts on the concept of masculinities?
Gramsci is, I guess, the best known of them now through the concept of hegemony and through his work on intellectuals. And I found his work on intellectuals and on cultural pattern, on the cultural dimension of hegemony, really helpful in understanding what was going on in my own society when I sort of began work as a social thinker, as a sociologist. It's a bit of a jump, of course, to take a concept from the domain of class relations, and that was where Gramsci was basically working. He was thinking about pattern of class relations, especially in the Italian South, and take the concept and shift it over to the world of gender relations, to understanding patterns in the gender order, because we can't simply translate structures of class to structures of gender. And I think that's now quite widely accepted. So at best there's an analogy, and Gramsci, I think, is useful in posing questions that we can also pose in relation to gender, though we may come up with rather different answers. So, if we go the other way, there's actually no concept in class analysis that plays the same role as the concept of hegemonic masculinity would play in gender analysis. The structures are significantly different. Certainly, Gramsci was critical of the mechanical Marxist idea of false consciousness, where the party, the Marxist theorist, was supposed to know the truth, and the workers didn't yet know it and had to be told the truth. So good for him. That's a basic democratic position, is to think that people do actually understand their situation. I guess in that, the analogy there in gender relations is that it was possible for feminists to suggest that women, or many women, had suffered from false consciousness in not seeing their own interest in the reform of patriarchy. Now, there are political dilemmas there, of course, because there are significant groups of women who support the patriarchal church or support patriarchal political leaders, and we've actually had a really striking demonstration of that in the United States presidential election recently, where an actual majority of white women who voted for Trump. So in that case, it seems that racial solidarity was more powerful than whatever gender solidarity went in for Hillary Clinton's campaign. It's much more difficult to apply a concept of false consciousness to men or masculinities, I think, and I don't know that has been very seriously tried. So, the way that the term has been important for me is simply posing questions about, how structures of power become at least temporarily stabilized, what investment members of subordinated groups may have in those structures of power, So what, for instance, have marginalised men to gain from the maintenance of a hegemonic pattern of masculinity? Why do men, or some men who are sort of disadvantaged and even oppressed by it, nevertheless continue to invest in it in some respect? And why do some groups of women invest in the maintenance of hegemonic patterns of masculinity? Those are important questions, difficult ones, significant for politics. We do have some indications in research of answers to them, I think. For instance, in the research on politically conservative women. Not so much yet in research on marginalised groups of men, but some clues there too, and those are really interesting areas of gender analysis.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. Have a very nice day.
Thank you for inviting me to share this way. I too wish the best to the conference. I hope the discussions go very well, and I'll be most interested to hear what comes out of it. So go well.